We start tonight's performance with the words of Howard Zinn, who inspired our readings this evening.
I start from the supposition that the world is topsy-turvy, that things are all wrong, that the wrong people are in jail and the wrong people are out of jail, that the wrong people are in power and the wrong people are out of power, that the wealth is distributed in this country and the world in such a way as not simply to require small reform, but to require a drastic reallocation of wealth. I start from the supposition that we don't have to say too much about this because all we have to do is think about the state of the world today and realize that things are all upside down. Daniel Berrigan is in jail, a Catholic priest, a poet who opposes the war, and J. Edgar Hoover is free. At Kent State University, 4 students were killed by the National Guard, and students were indicted. So we have to start from that supposition, that things are really topsy-turvy. And our topic is topsy-turvy, civil disobedience. As soon as you say the topic is civil disobedience, you're saying our problem is civil disobedience. That is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is the numbers of people all over the world who have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. We have to transcend these national boundaries in our thinking. Nixon and Brezhnev have much more in common with one another than we have with Nixon. J. Edgar Hoover has far more in common with the head of the Soviet secret police than he has with us. That's why we're always surprised when they get together. They smile, they shake hands, they smoke cigars. They really like one another, no matter what they say. What we are trying to do, I assume, is really get back to the principles and aims and spirit of the Declaration of Independence. This spirit is resistance to illegitimate authority and to forces that deprive people of their life and liberty and right to pursue happiness. And therefore, under these conditions, it urges the right to alter or abolish their current form of government. And the stress had been on abolish. But to establish the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we're going to need to go outside the law. My hope is that this kind of spirit will take place not just in this country, but in other countries, because they all need it. People in all countries need the spirit of disobedience to the state. And we need a kind of declaration of interdependence among people in all countries of the world who are striving for the same thing.
The folk hymn, "Keep Your Hands on the Plow," was transformed into an anthem of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and its lyrics changed to reflect the times. The name of the song, in its most famous version, became "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize."
Freedom's name is mighty sweet, and soon we are gonna meet. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Silas bound in jail. jail, have no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Well, the only chains we can stand are the chains of the hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Well, I got my hand on the freedom plow. Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on.
I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clear thing of that matter, as I did last winter when I went into Missouri and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally brought them to Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. Had I interfered in the manner which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either their father, their mother, their brother, their sister, their wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that whatsoever I would that men would do unto me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as I am bound with them. I endeavored to act upon that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done. Years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings. And I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I am opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. This order of things cannot always endure. I've registered my protest against it. I recognize the feebleness of my effort, but fortunately, I'm not alone. There are multiplied thousands of others who, like myself, have come to realize that before we may truly enjoy the blessings of a civilized life, we must reorganize society upon a mutual and cooperative basis. And to this end, we have organized a great economic and political movement that spreads over the face of all the earth. The time is coming, in spite of all opposition, all persecution, when this emancipating gospel will spread among all the peoples, and when this minority will become the triumphant majority and, sweeping into power, inaugurate the greatest social and economic change in history. On that day, we shall have the universal commonwealth, the harmonious cooperation of every nation with every other nation on earth. Your Honor, I ask no mercy, and I plead for no immunity. I realize that finally, the right must prevail. I never so clearly comprehended as now the great struggle between the powers of greed and exploitation on the one hand, and upon the other, the rising host of industrial freedom and social justice. I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity. The people are awakening. In due time, they will and must come to their own.
I ran away from home at age 17. I had to because there wasn't enough money to feed the family in 1933 during the Depression. One of the ways to get a job was to go down to the stockyards. Every morning you got there by 6 or 6:30. There were just so many benches and they would all be filled early. They would only need 1, maybe 2 people. This woman, Mrs. McCann, the women's hiring director, would look around for the biggest, brawniest person. "Have you had experience?" she asked. I said, "Well, not in the stockyards, but we used to butcher our own hogs at home." I carried this big steel, and that impressed her. Mrs. McCann hired me. In 1933 to 34, we worked 6-hour shifts at 37.5 cents an hour. We had to work at a high rate of speed. It was summer. It would be so hot sometimes that women used to pass out. We started talking union. The thing that precipitated it is that on the floor below, they used to make hot dogs, and one of the women, in putting the meat into the chopper, got her fingers caught. There were no safety guards. It was horrible. 3 of us, colonizers, had a meeting during our break and decided this was the time to have a stoppage, and we did. All 6 floors went on strike. We just stopped working right inside the building, protesting the speed and the unsafe conditions. Soon after the work stoppage, the supervisors were looking for the leaders because people were talking up the action. They found out who was involved, and we were all fired. I was blacklisted. I got a job doing housework again, and it was horrible. I couldn't stand it. I would rather go back and work in a factory any day or night. A friend of mine who had been laid off told me that she got called to go back to work. I went down to the stockyards, and it was the same department, exactly the same job on the same floor where I had been fired. But it was the afternoon, and Mrs. McCann wasn't there. Her assistant was. She told me that I would start work the following afternoon. I got my hair cut really short and hennaed. I thinned my eyebrows and penciled them, wore a lot of lipstick and painted my nails. I came in looking sharp and not like a country girl. So I passed right through, and I was hired as Helen Ellis on the same job. After several days, the forelady, Mary, came around and said, "Okay, Helen, I know you're stellar. I won't say anything, but just keep quiet." She knew I was pro-union, and I guess she was, too, so I kept the job as Helen Ellis until I got laid off. Later on, I was blacklisted under the name Ellis. If you even talked about union, you were fired. So we actually had secret meetings. Everybody had to vouch for anyone that they brought to that meeting. We organized women's groups, young women's groups. They like to dance, and I love to dance, so we went dancing together, and I talked to them about the union. The women were interested after a while when they saw that the union could actually win things for them, like bread and butter things. When I look back now, I really think we had a lot of guts, but I didn't even stop to think about it at the time. It was something that just had to be done. We had a goal. That's what we felt had to be done, and we did it.
Over the last 10 years, the Negro decided to straighten his back up, realizing that a man cannot ride your back unless it's bent. With all the struggle and all the achievements, we must face the fact, however, that the Negro still lives in the basement of the great civil society. And so we still have a long way to go before we can reach the promised land of freedom. We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of the restructuring of the whole of American society. There are over 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that the more and more we begin to ask questions about the whole society, we are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in its life's marketplace. But one day, we must come to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that the people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 of water? These are words that must be said. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will make them things. And therefore, they will exploit them, and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. Now, I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will be inevitable setbacks, and there will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our hopes blasted. We may again, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand up before the bier of some courageous civil rights worker whose life will be snuffed out by the dastardly acts of bloodthirsty mobs. But difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. And with this faith, we will be able to sing in some not too distant tomorrow, with a cosmic past tense, we have overcome. We have overcome. Deep in my heart, I did believe we would overcome.
A friend of mine in New York City has a half-fare transit card, which means that you get on buses and subways for half price. And the other day, when he showed his card to the token attendant, the attendant asked what his disability was, and he said, I have AIDS. And the attendant said, no, you don't. If you had AIDS, you'd be home dying. And so I want to speak out today as a person with AIDS who is not dying. You know, for the last 3 years since I was diagnosed, my family thinks two things about my situation. One, they think I'm going to die, and two, they think my government's doing absolutely everything in their power to stop that. And they're wrong on both counts. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows, which are interested in me as a human interest story, only as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life. You know, living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war, which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends, but nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare, and only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. No one else seems to be noticing. Someday, the AIDS crisis will be over. Remember that. And when that day comes, when that day has come and gone, there'll be people alive on this earth, gay people, straight people, men, women, black and white, who will hear the story that once there was a terrible disease in this country and all over the world, and that a brave group of people stood up and fought, and in some cases gave their lives, so that other people might live.
Silence is golden, or so I was told when I was young. Later, everything changed. Silence equals death, the queer activists fighting the neglect and repression around AIDS shouted in the streets. Silence is the ocean of the unsaid, the unspeakable, the repressed, the erased, the unheard. It surrounds the scattered islands made up of those allowed to speak and of what can be said and who listens. Silence is what allows people to suffer without recourse, what allows hypocrisies and lies to grow and flourish, crimes to go unpunished. If our voices are essential aspects of our humanity, to be rendered voiceless is to be dehumanized or excluded from one's humanity. And the history of silence is central to women's history. Being unable to tell your story is a living death, and sometimes a literal one. If no one listens when you say your ex-husband is trying to kill you, if no one believes you when you say you are in pain, if no one hears you when you say help, if you don't dare say help, if you have been trained not to bother people by saying help. Liberation is always in part a storytelling process, breaking stories, breaking silences, making new stories. A free person tells her own story. A valued person lives in a society in which her story has a place. Violence against women is often against our voices and our stories. It is a refusal of our voices and of what a voice means. The right to self-determination, to participation, to consent or dissent, to live and participate, to interpret and narrate. By voice, I don't only mean literal voice, but the ability to speak up, to participate, to experience oneself and be experienced as a free person with rights. This includes the right not to speak, whether it's the right against being tortured to confess, as political prisoners are, or not to be expected to service strangers who approach you, as some men do to young women, demanding attention and flattery and punishing their absence. The idea of voice, expanded to the idea of agency, includes wide realms of power and powerlessness. The struggle of liberation has been in part to create the conditions for the formerly silenced to speak and be heard. Silence is what allowed predators to rampage through the decades unchecked. It's as though the voices of those prominent public men devoured the voices of others into nothingness, a narrative cannibalism. They rendered them voiceless to refuse and afflicted with unbelievable stories. Unbelievable means those with power did not want to know, to hear, to believe, did not want them to have voices. People died from being unheard. Then something changed. If the right to speak, if having credibility, if being heard is a kind of wealth, that wealth is finally being redistributed.
At a challenging moment in our history, let us remind ourselves that we, the hundreds of thousands, the millions of women, trans people, men, and youth who are here at the Women's March, we represent the powerful forces of change that are determined to prevent the dying cultures of racism and heteropatriarchy from rising again. We recognize that we are collective agents of history, and that history cannot be deleted like web pages. We know that we gather this afternoon on Indigenous land, and we follow the lead of the First Peoples who, despite massive genocidal violence, have never relinquished the struggle for land, water, culture, their people. We especially salute today the Standing Rock Sioux. The freedom struggles of Black people that have shaped the very nature of this country's history cannot be deleted with the sweep of a hand. We cannot be made to forget that Black lives do matter. This is a country anchored in slavery and colonialism, which means, for better or for worse, the very history of the United States is a history of immigration and enslavement, spreading xenophobia, hurling accusations of murder and rape, and building walls will not erase history. No human being is illegal. The struggle to save the planet, to stop climate change, to guarantee the accessibility of water from the lands of the Standing Rock Sioux to Flint, Michigan, to the West Bank and Gaza, the struggle to save our flora and fauna, to save the air, this is ground zero of the struggle for social justice. This is a women's march, and this women's march represents the promise of feminism as against the pernicious powers of state violence. An inclusive and intersectional feminism that calls upon all of us to join the resistance to racism, to Islamophobia, to anti-Semitism, to misogyny, to capitalist exploitation. Yes, we salute the fight for 15. We dedicate ourselves to collective resistance. Resistance to the billionaire mortgage profiteers and gentrifiers. Resistance to the healthcare privateers. Resistance to the attacks on Muslims and on immigrants. Resistance to attacks on disabled people. Resistance to state violence perpetrated by the police and through the prison industrial complex. Resistance to institutional and intimate gender violence, especially against trans women of color. Women's rights and human rights are rights all over this planet. And that is why we say freedom and justice for Palestine. Over the next months and years, we will be called upon to intensify our demands for social justice, to become more and more militant in our defense of vulnerable populations. Those who will defend the supremacy of the white male heteropatriarchy had better watch out. The next 1,459 days of the Trump administration must be 1,459 days of resistance. Resistance on the ground, resistance in the classrooms, resistance on the job, resistance in our art, resistance in our music. This is just the beginning. And in the words of the inimitable Ella Baker, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
It's time we build bridges instead of walls, and give peace a chance to come across the wall. Too long we've been isolated. It's time we communicated. It's time we build bridges instead of walls. It's time we make peace instead of wars. It's time we make friends instead of guns. All for one and one for all. Divided we stand and divided we fall. It's time we build bridges instead of walls. it's time. Well, that's nice. It's time. Oh, it's just time. We saw the other side. And time will find the words with the other guy. Yeah, he's alright. Let's get to know each other better, and no doubt we will scream aloud. Yeah, it's time we build bridges instead of walls. Oh, yeah, it's time we build bridges instead of walls. Time we build bridges instead of walls.
What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't blame them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen can make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity and your own newsletter. 10,000 power and your own paper. 100,000 your own media, kind of like Amy Goodman. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more.
Christopher Bruce, Meshell Ndegeocello, Staceyann Chin, Celisse Henderson, Ethan Hawke, Sian Clifford, Viggo Mortensen, Ntare Guma Mbaho Mwine.
right, man.